As part of their commitment to continue learning and adding value, the Answer series has launched a podcast series titled Around the Table with its CEO George Eadie. The series aims to deepen understanding of the education system in South Africa. And to tell us more about this, George Eadie joins us now via Zoom. George, a very good morning to you. Thank you so much for joining us. Welcome to Morning Live.
Good morning, Simpiwe. It's fantastic to be here to talk about this really important challenge that we have in our country of trying to fix education. Thank you.
Indeed, it's an absolute pleasure having you join us this morning, George. Now, give us more information on what the Around the Table podcast series is all about.
So you mentioned it, really, education is going through great change. There's superb pressure to explore technological innovations, while at the same time we're dealing with, a huge catch-up problem when it comes to COVID. And that was on top of already a system that left a lot to be desired. And so our thinking at the Answer series is, how can we learn the fastest about the system and how to help make it better? And in doing so, maybe we can actually just share that learning with the nation at large. And so in our kind of, one step way, we chose to do a podcast, and we're speaking now to some of the leading thought leaders and influencers in education to better understand things like what is the plan with teacher development, what is the plan with understanding how we track learners and whether they're dropping off or not. And overall, what is the whole purpose of the education system in terms of preparing learners for the world of work? Lots of big themes coming through that we all need to understand to better be able to help solve the problem.
And why was there a need for you, George, to produce a series that focuses specifically on South Africa's education?
Well, as far as I'm aware, and please anyone let me know, that there isn't really a podcast dedicated to speaking to the thought leaders in the way that we are at the moment.
Yeah.
And so this conversation isn't happening enough, and we're not getting access to people that, for instance, like one of our podcast guests coming up, we're going to discuss, what's the curriculum, what informs the curriculum, and how should it evolve in the future going forward. These are pieces of information that there's just a big gap in knowledge around, and as a consequence, a lot of people find themselves frustrated or even critical of other people in the system. And if there's one thing I've learned about this podcast series so far, is that the only way we're going to fix education is if we all do our little bit and we encourage each other and don't be critical of the places in the system that are not yet up to standard. So if our podcast can contribute to all of that, that would be fantastic.
And what are some of the core issues that are discussed in this podcast and, those that you aim to highlight through this podcast?
Well, very recently, we've interviewed the headmaster of Somerset College down in the Western Cape. He and his team had released some research regarding the value of face-to-face learning. Clearly, face-to-face learning has been something that's been missing in the education system for the last year and a half. And a lot of online solutions are very necessary to solve some of the catch-up plans and even some of the fundamental problems in education. But at the same time, he introduced some information to help balance that, because social and emotional development until now has actually been a big feature and a big attribute of schooling, in his opinion. And so we're having this debate, and in the coming podcast, we're going to be interviewing some folks from the UCT Online High School to really understand things like, in South Africa, we have many more learners entering the school system than we have schools to accommodate them. And that rate is only increasing. We're having more and more learners, and the speed of new schools is not increasing. So we need a new strategy. And understanding all these dynamics is a big feature. We've spoken to the likes of Sizwe Nkasana, who's the chairman of the NECT. And, he himself is actually undergoing teacher training at the moment to get a first-hand experience of what it means to learn to be a teacher in South Africa at the moment, and informing himself and consequently one of the most influential bodies in education in South Africa, what the next best moves are. So these are the kinds of people we're speaking to, and it's a great discussion, and I'm personally learning so much, and I hope that those that are listening in are doing the same.
Yeah, and your first episode focused on the discussion around the current status of education in South Africa, and there was a list of various speakers that you mentioned. You mentioned the likes of Sizwe Nxasane that you've already featured, and as well as those you have lined up. Who are some of these, and what's the thought process in selecting some of these speakers?
The thought process is literally to think, what would be some of the big questions that, that we could ask, and if we had the answers to those questions,
yes,
we would be able to better inform our actions in helping to solve the education situation. And so when thinking of a question like, what is the job to do and the future of teachers and teaching in South Africa? And so there we spoke to the Dean of Education at the University of Johannesburg, who's been working for 15 years at the pinnacle of her career in thinking into the job of teacher development. And so how much of a privilege that was to learn about the dynamics that they're dealing with, the challenges they face. And ultimately, like, one of the insights that came out of that was that the culture of development within the school that the new teachers go into is a huge determinant in, number one, having that teacher feel that they can be successful as a teacher, and number two, retaining that teacher in the world of teaching before they get despondent. And so it's all of these kinds of nuances that, and for instance, that insight, the idea that development and culture within the school, that's not a budgetary item. So often what we talk about is that, we're spending so much money and, we're not getting bang for buck. But actually, so many of the insights that are coming through so far about taking a greater level of responsibility, and that falls on everyone. It includes parents. How can we be more grateful and more supportive to the school environments, rather than holding too high expectations of our teachers without the consequent support. So it's people like Dr. Sarah Gravett.
George, I'm actually wondering if there will be a discussion on the evolution of education here in South Africa. I mean, we're now looking into online learning and the state of readiness for the South African education system to wholly embrace this mode of learning.
It's a big topic right now. I mean, I think it was when I posted the news about the UCT Online High School on my LinkedIn profile a couple of months ago, my feed just went berserk. People are so excited about what they're trialing, and it's hitting on all the things in education right now that need to be fixed. Right now, one of the themes is that too many learners are getting pushed through from grade to grade without yet having mastered the topics. UCT Online High School are really trying to address that. But I would say the deepest level that I've been able to glean so far, and I'm going to be speaking to a member of their leadership in the coming weeks. But one of the biggest things so far is this idea of the supply of schooling is insufficient to meet the demand.
Okay.
And if we carry on relying on brick and mortar schools, we're just going to fall further and further behind. So we need to be thinking differently. And this debate is a high consequence debate because it's the future of our nation at stake.
Sure.
These are our future leaders that have to
All right, George, I'm told that we're out of time. Interesting point you're making there, but unfortunately we're out of time. I would have loved us to engage more on this particular matter. But thank you so much for joining us this morning.
It's a great pleasure. Good luck to all involved in education. Thank you, Simpiwe.
Indeed, thank you. That was the CEO of the Answer series, George Eadie, and he's been speaking to us about, the podcast aptly called Around the Table.